Call to order the Cincinnati Preschool Promise Board of Managers meeting on April 23rd at 4 p.m. The first.
Sorry, not yet. We're.
What? Oh.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. I just want to do everything by the books here. So.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
The first order of business is to conduct a roll call. I'd like you please to reply when your name is called. Father Mike Graham, yes. Cheryl Rose.
Yes.
Debbie Alsop.
Yes.
Terry England.
Yes.
Bianca Edwards. Christine Fisher.
Yes.
Marcia Futel. Micah Camaras.
Yes.
Tony Hobson.
Yes.
Gary Lindgren. Odell Owens. Laura San Regret.
Yes.
Pastor Ennis Tate.
Yes.
Sally Westheimer.
Yes.
And Vanessa White. All right, well, we'll keep our eyes peeled for those who aren't here. Seeing as we have a quorum, before moving on to the approval of the agenda.
Marcia joined.
Oh, she did, Marcia Futel?
Yeah. Oh, Marcia, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Marcia.
Hi.
Welcome. There's a special announcement that I need to make in light of our the particulars of the meeting. I would like to note that in conjunction with Ohio State's stay-at-home order and the rule limiting the number of people who may meet in a space and who may so meet, CPP has decided to convene the Board of Managers meeting via video conference. In accordance with the Ohio Public Records and Open Meeting laws, CPP has advertised the meeting on its website in advance and has provided a link for members of the public to listen and view the meeting. This meeting will be recorded, and a copy of the meeting will be included in any documentation, including any documentation, will be made available via the CPP website under the area Board of Directors, and then approve meeting minutes as soon as practical after the meeting. Just a friendly reminder, those of you who are pros at this by now, which is I think all of us, we're asked to silence and mute all electronic devices, and when not speaking, mute ourselves. So with that, I'll turn to the agenda as such, and our first order of business is to approve the minutes.
I have a correction to the minutes.
Thank you.
Are you excited about that?
What means, I am definitely excited about that.
Vanessa Freitag's name was misspelled. It's F-R-E-Y-T-A-G.
But thank you very much. You'll get that to Leslie, will you?
Yes, I will.
Perfect, thanks so very much. Are there any other corrections of the meeting minutes from last time? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve them then, please.
So moved.
Let's see, in my column, reading down, I'm at the top, then Debbie Alsop, and then Tony Hobson. I think both of you said something, did you?
Yes. Tony, okay. I'll let you have it this time.
Okay, Tony moved it. Debbie seconded. And I'll just ask if there's anybody who would vote not to approve them. If anybody would vote not to approve them, please say so. Or those abstaining? I'll take it then that the motion to approve the minutes made by Tony, seconded by Debbie, was unanimously approved. Oh, that's right. We need to do the agenda approval. I'm getting one of those chat messages. So if you look at the agenda, please. It's concise, as you can imagine, although there'll be a very meaty middle of it as we hear about the incredible response that the staff has led under Char's direction in the midst of the current pandemic crisis. That'll be a very important update for us all. But you can see the agenda in front of us, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda then.
So moved by Carol.
Thank you very much. I appreciate saying who's.
I'll second it.
And that was Debbie?
Sally.
Sally, thank you, Sally. So all those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. We'll just do it that way.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed or abstaining? So on a motion made by Cheryl Rose, seconded by Sally Westheimer, the agenda was also unanimously approved, which will take us into the big heart of the meeting, which is the CPP's COVID-19 response. So Char, I'll just turn things over to you to walk us through all this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The first few slides that you'll see is kind of a timeline to walk you through kind of what's happened in the last 30, 40 days. Gives a high level of what you kind of all saw play out, but with the critical parts that were most important to Preschool Promise and the work that we do in terms of closure of child care programs, pandemic licensure, the issuing of the family child care programs being allowed to participate in that pandemic licensure and sites reopening. Also, CARES Act and how that came out as an opportunity for child care programs and our preschool providers. And then you will also see on the next slide, as we move kind of a little bit into April, talking about what all the things that happened. So again, our first concern at Preschool Promise, it was talking about health and safety of providers and staff as the front line and what we were going to do to address that. The immediate needs of the parents and providers and walking through that as well to make sure those immediate needs were met. Making sure that we could do business supports because that is what most providers requested that we needed. And then shifting what our communication strategy was to make sure that we could get all of those things done, and finally turning to ongoing program delivery. And again, timeline is highlighted. You've all been seeing those in the public of what's been happening. So we just did 2 high-level timeline slides. And so we'll move to the next slide. How we did our shift in operations. Staff has been working remotely since March 16th. We were fortunate that we didn't have any shifts or changes in our processing of payment and what we did with our fiscal matters. The key ways in that our communication strategy changed is who we communicated to, what we communicated, when and how. As you can all imagine, the frequency of communications has greatly gone up. We've used our social media channels in a way that we've never have before. We've launched our YouTube channel for Promise readers. As Board of Managers, you will see that you get bi-weekly updates, at least from us, of things that are happening. And we have also increased our outreach to parents that we'll talk about a little bit later. That includes the new parent Facebook and direct communication from CPP staff to our parents. Another highlight that we started last week, recognizing that we had to shift that communication strategy a little bit because providers were feeling overwhelmed, a little bit too taxed with information, is now that we operate in a cohort model. So every member of the CPP staff is responsible for a cohort of providers that they will be with for the next 12 months. That will be the first point of contact so that providers know there is a person with a name, cell phone, email address that they can contact directly with any questions and concerns at any time. That means that it takes us about a week for us to go through to contact each one of us, our 20 to 25 providers that were assigned, but that gives us real-time pulse on what's going on with the providers and how we can be most responsive to what those needs are. The next slide will give you kind of a key function status update of where we are with operations. There are some things that we've been able to continue. The remote learning instruction, great thanks to the great partnership with CPS. Continuing our coaching, thanks to the mobility of 4C to be able to say, how do we do this remotely and continue to provide these opportunities? Our tuition assistance is ongoing, and we have updated our attendance policy in line with what's been done for publicly funded childcare and Head Start to extend our excused absence policy through April 30th. We have gotten questions from providers about why we only extended it through April 30th, not through the end of the academic or program year. The reason that we did the policy change in that way is that most of our community providers are governed by JFS rules, not DOE and the same academic calendar rules. And at this point, childcare programs have only been ordered closed through April 30th. If that is extended, our policy will follow suit and has been drafted to cover that because it has listed as an excused absence any mandatory state closure or COVID-19 related closure. Our evaluation process is also continuing. Innovations has done a great job in converting what they thought were going to be in-person interviews to online surveys that are very visually appealing and pared down to get the information. They've been doing roundtable and key informant interviews as well. And I'm also pleased to say that Crane got started last week with reaching out to teachers again and are back on track to make sure that we can get all those evaluations done in a timely manner. We have ongoing, as you know, enrollment. Our re-enrollment date was pushed back from March 1st to May 1st at the request of many parents and providers to say, go ahead and put up what that new application looks like. Let us apply and tell you what we plan to do. And so that will be live in the new version and the updates beginning on May 1st. Our staff support fund and TPG as supports and cohorts has been postponed, but we're ready to restart those when the time is right. Staff support fund is in a very attractive package that will be circulating to the cost of quality work group for feedback and input. So we are ready to do that. And our community engagement strategies have been redesigned that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Budget planning is starting again in April that I know Cheryl and Hector will talk about again. We are having all of our work group and committee meetings virtually, and our marketing and public relations have shifted. We had our billboards out, so we didn't want to take those down and redo those, but we've put a stop to things like ordering more yard signs, doing bus wraps, the usual things that we had planned to do in this time. So that's kind of a snapshot on where we are in our basic activities. Okay. Next slide gives you a snapshot of where we are with our providers. This is data that is accurate as of the 16th of April. As some of you may know, the pandemic licensure site is updated sometimes as frequently as twice a day. We only pull it down and update it once a week because we have to do that as a manual process to determine which providers have been granted pandemic licensure and which ones are still in operation. The highlights and the things that we have done with providers since the start of all this is making sure that we could help them navigate through the pandemic licensure process, that they understood the changes to the rules and the regulations, the most important one being that the new ratio for preschools is 6-to-1. We're 6 students with 1 teacher or instructor, which means the structure had to change in many ways. Talking to them about how Preschool Promise to students would continue, and very importantly, making sure that they had resources to pass along to parents, whether those were resources on how parents were navigating unemployment, to making sure that they had access to food and food security, to talking about how they may be able to access the internet for those remote learnings. We had to build out a whole separate section, as many did, on our website to talk about things that weren't only related to education and Preschool Promise, but basic needs of parents and families to pass that along. Our goal with all of our providers and why we started with them is that the providers were the front line that we knew had the best connection to the parents. And our goal was to keep providers informed, respond to what the requests were, keep them encouraged, and make sure that they were stabilized during this difficult time. It also was our goal to make sure that we didn't duplicate services that were already out there, but that we were able to fill the gap for providers. And so we knew that CPS was doing a fantastic job with remote learning materials. Anything from the new Spectrum CPS TV to the remote learning packs that we passed out, that was taken care of. 4C was also doing a very good job as the CCR&R, making sure that regulatory and compliance matters were well taken care of. We just had to make sure that providers had access to that information and were getting it. The gap came when we started talking about things related to how community providers ran their business, how they navigated their HR issues, how they may access other funding to keep them afloat, what questions they could answer about unemployment for their own businesses. So we launched a series of webinars that talked people through the CARES Act, the EIDLs, and the PPP loans, that talked about tax and accounting, grant opportunities and how to fill out the grant applications, connecting them again with the African American Chamber of Commerce. We were able to do this by saying we know that CPP is not the expert in these places, but connecting them to industry experts that were. We were very careful to walk through with counsel at Katz Teller, and Jake has been wonderful in making sure that we did appropriate disclosures and we were covered for any liability to make sure that we said this is information share, we're not creating a contractual relationship or providing expert advice. And so far that has been very helpful to do them as live webinars and posted on the website for ongoing for people to go back and visit as well. We also know that those business supports that we may need to offer providers will continue. We are doing that in partnership with other organizations like 4C as well, who had given some foresight to this and what that may look like. Now is the time for us to be able to step up and provide those services and to make sure that there's national information out there, there's statewide information out there, but that we connect providers with the local contacts that they can call. So the webinars included things like, this is the local SBDC office that's on McMillan Street and the person that you can call. This is a local tax preparer that has worked with 10 preschool or child care programs that you can call and consider for services. These are the things that you can get for free. So we wanted to make sure that we could be that information conduit for providers. We also have recognized that for providers with quality improvement, the state has kind of said status quo as of March 26th is going to continue, so that there is a 6-month extension for renewals on Step Up to Quality. The deadline that had previously been July 1 is now extended to September 1st for everyone to have a star rating in the Step Up to Quality system. And so with that hold, we know that no providers were in danger of not being able to operate or not being able to have access to publicly funded childcare, but it also presented itself with an opportunity that those that may not have had as much time to devote to those Step Up to Quality and meeting with their coaches, they now have that time. And what we've heard from most providers is they are interested in continuing with that professional development and meeting with their coaches to be able to get that done during this time. Deeper look at who our providers are that are providing pandemic care. Overall, 32% of our providers have gotten pandemic care licenses. Now, we know that some of those may continue and may not continue on a week-to-week basis based on, 1, the health of their staff, 2, however they're able to financially manage that new 6-to-1 ratio and all the things required for that. I am pleased to say that we have at least one pandemic site in every Quality Gap neighborhood that was licensed, so that we know there were no neighborhoods that were identified as Quality Gap that didn't have a provider. When we look a little bit deeper to say who is really providing these pandemic services, when we look at the QI providers that are doing it, 41% of QI providers chose to seek a pandemic license, and of that 41%, 82 are family child care providers. Right? So that gives you a snapshot of who is doing that care. We also saw this as an opportunity, again, to elevate the model of Type A and Type B providers as being uniquely positioned to manage that 6-to-1 ratio or the smaller child ratio, because that's what they do every day. So we have looked to them to say, how does this work? How does that ratio play out in other models? We're working very closely with 4C and others to look at what we can do to forecast that economic modeling and that business plan that is built on those smaller ratios. So I'll take a breath and see if anybody has questions about provider update and what's going on with providers.
Any questions for Chara so far?
I had a couple questions. One is, when you talked about dividing the staff, giving the staff a group to stay in touch with, what is the role of metrics staff? Do they have any special assignments during this time?
They do. So the metrics team has 3 special assignments that we've asked them, right? They are the first line that serves sort of as our call center. They triage all the calls. When we send out an email, we tell them, be ready for these calls to come in, help us navigate what those calls are. They also are helping us maintain an FAQ list of all of the questions that come in, so that as we shape our communications that go out, we are responsive to questions that may be common, and we share those with others. Metrics is still doing the payment processing as they normally do. They are still helping us on a regular basis as we send email out about specific issues related to parent matters and provider matters. So they're doing much the same as they've always done, with an increased call volume and increased communication role. So before, we may have sent a communication out to parents probably once a quarter, if that much, through metrics. That looks more like sending out that communication weekly, if not every other week.
Okay, my one other question was about the pandemic childcare. When we first heard about it, it was going to be for the frontline, particularly medical workers, is it open to anybody who's working? Or
It is
just
no, there is a specific JFS definition of what an essential worker was. So when it was first opened, the very first day, medical workers had priority, and there was a definition of the professions that were considered essential workers. After that first day, that definition expanded, but there is a clear definition that JFS has put out of who is essential workers. It is left to the provider to ask the parent to fill out a form that acknowledges how they are an essential worker.
so grocery store workers, et cetera, can access.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Of course. So in addition to supporting the providers, we've also done some additional work with our parents that you will see on the next slide. Again, addressing core family needs, helping them determine if they met the essential worker designation, and that was really just passing on JFS's information on what that definition was, making sure that they had many sources for remote learning. We did contactless delivery to providers of the packs that CPS assembled that we could pass along. We send regular information on social media sites and YouTubes to make sure that parents have that information. Flo and Kim Bolden, our P team member, have done a wonderful job of reinvigorating our Preschool Promise parent-only Facebook site that does post every other day with anything from Mental Health Monday to Talk About It Tuesday to Wacky Wednesday, to make sure that that is a space where parents can get information, post questions, and respond to those in an environment that's just parents. We've also been focusing on our, the question we're asked is, what is our plan for retention and recruitment? And the best way that we have approach that retention and recruitment is much easier when we strengthen the relationship that we have with parents as the Preschool Promise, and strengthen the relationship and make it easier for providers to have that ongoing relationship with their parents as well. In terms of recruitment, it is us continuing to elevate the message about how important preschool is in the early childhood education environment, and how Preschool Promise is here to support that. There are some very specific things that Flo has done in terms of, virtual onboarding for providers. I think Lakeisha has done a great job to also say those community councils that are still holding meetings, we are still participating in those. Went to one at Kennedy Heights this week to let people know that the Preschool Promise is still there. So all of the things that we had devised kind of in our community engagement strategy for retention and recruitment and outreach, those are happening as they can virtually. But we're also working very closely with CPS and Vera and that team to say, how do we tackle this as a team and as a group, not just a CPP plan, but an overall plan of what's happening in the early childhood education system. Okay. And again, this talks about the network, right? I can't say enough about how good it has been to partner with CPS and work together regularly with daily contact that I have with Vera on how we're doing this. The amazing work that 4C for Children has done, not only as the CCR&R, but as an advocacy leader in this space, and as the coaching contractor that we rely on most heavily to really go above and beyond to say, how are we all figuring this out together? The leadership of Groundwork Ohio at the beginning to say, how do we advocate for this? How do we launch those webinars on a first stage? And how are we considering how to drive the early childhood education agenda at the state level and at the federal level? And the support of Promise Forward, who said, brief us on what's happening and tell us how we can be supportive and help to make sure that Preschool Promise is able to continue. We have 3, 4, 5 convenings and work groups every week with Dayton Preschool Promise and Groundwork Ohio group, a local implementation group that meets with Success by 6 that's really focused kind of on what happens in this region, a new initiative, Early Lending Network by Strive Partnership, and of course the equity work that's happening with All In Cincinnati and that core team and their focus on what particularly happens with the childcare and education community. So that's just a snapshot to kind of give you an idea of where Preschool Promise is playing in the larger network and how we're all working collectively to try to design new strategies and solutions to address the challenges that we have.
Tara, before you move on, there's a lot on this one slide, it seems to me. And so I wanted to pause and see if there's any particular questions that people might have. I'd also like to invite you to say a bit about the meeting that you had earlier in the week with the leadership of Promise Forward.
Yes, it's been a busy week. So we did a briefing with the executive committee of Promise Forward that went very well. Of course, asked tough questions, but also was very complimentary of the work that we're doing going forward, and also willing to be that extra voice and that extra conduit to make sure that all of this information is reaching the community providers and the parents that we serve. Presentations were also this week to the Cincinnati education panel, as well as leaders of the Amos Project and the CPS board as well. All of those presentations, I would say, was very well received. There were no questions that we were kind of caught off guard with. Lots of nodding and thumbs up, and more a spirit of collaboration than we've ever felt before.
Good, wonderful. Anybody else have any questions for Chara?
Yes,
all right.
Father Graham, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Marcia. Yes, there you are.
Yes, so just real quick, Shara, if you can just a question. When you talked about remote learning, and I know that's been in the news a lot from the K through 12 perspective, but how effective have we been at reaching all of the parents with remote learning? What percentage would you say in the space that we operate here, have we reached those parents?
I would not venture to give you a number until after next week, when we have collected all of those information and calls. To tell you kind of what's been happening, we made a decision as a staff that last week and the beginning of this week was not going to be an information gathering call. It was going to be a wellness check with all of our providers, and that we weren't going to do business other than to say, how are you doing? So now is the time for us to turn to what's happening with remote learning and how does that look? What is happening again with pandemic centers, and even what your attendance is and how many preschoolers are there? And what are our next steps to provide you with resources? You know, the amount of time recommended for a preschooler to have screen time and other things is very different than other grade levels. And so we wanted to give providers kind of a chance to get up to speed to that, but we anticipate we'll face comparable challenges as we've heard from CPS, in that, one, how do we make sure we have contact with parents and they can use those remote learning tools? And that may be an access issue. When we start to talk about technology and what they have, early on we deployed the resources that were available for things like Spectrum, but we also, and cable service and internet service, but what we quickly learned, like everyone else, is that that was a 2-week lead time on how that they would get access to that. And if they had any lingering bills or other challenges, there was also a barrier to that. So I will tell you, it is a work in progress for us to be able to capture and measure the information about how much work remote learning is going on. What I can do better is tell you at our next report out what we've distributed and what our tracking and hits on the sites that we've made available, to give us some indicator of access. But I think it's going to take us some time to really tell you what the touch point and the contact has been. And part of it as well is we did not want to, in these first few weeks, bombard providers with any more data points and touch points than we needed to as they were trying to stabilize. But we did give the heads up when we sent out the communication about ongoing tuition assistance that, you know, we are here to provide support with that remote learning, and that we would be coming back to really assess what that looks like and how we can support it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hey, Chara, this is Tony Hobson. Are the pandemic centers serving a completely new population of students? Or are these students that we would have been serving in normal course?
So I think it's a mixture of both, Tony, because it is based on who is designated as an essential worker.
All right.
So what happened is, so that providers could change their structure, they had to close, apply or reapply for pandemic licensure, and that pandemic licensure had different regulations and rules, not only the ratio, but what they had to do. So part of the reason that we have to wait a week and a half more is we do data collection and attendance collection once a month. And so at the end of the month, we will know if our community providers that were pandemic providers had the same preschool promise kids, or new kids that were preschool promise, or new kids that may be eligible. And I think we are all working to determine how we make sure the resources follow the child and where our preschoolers are. You know, there are challenges that we have with things like, are there preschoolers that formerly attended a CPS preschool that are now at pandemic providers, but are still a preschool promise kid? Are there kids that are, you know, weren't eligible for PFCC or preschool promise dollars before, but now they are at TA providers? And we will, you know, it's the mix too, because we have not only tuition assistance providers, but we also have quality improvement providers that are all providing pandemic care. So we have a pretty good idea based on our partnership with 4C, the number of PFCC kids that are at each location. We don't have the next level down of how many of them are preschoolers and how many of them are preschool promise kids. We will at the end of the month when we have attendance records submitted.
This sounds overwhelming, trying to keep track, and then, you know, trying to figure out who gets tuition assistance and whether these are kids came from public school or whether they were in our program already, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure people have better things to do than submit their information. So you have my support in the collection of the data.
And I think we are, in many ways, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? And so we look to guidance and say, how is JFS addressing this to determine where the publicly funded childcare dollar goes? And so we've been waiting patiently to say, whatever system they develop, we'll use that same one. And so we're all still waiting to try to figure that out together, but it's of utmost importance in our mind, and I know in Hector's mind every day, and of course in metrics that helps us process that, to make sure that we are very careful with the taxpayer dollar and making sure that we make sure those funds get allocated in the right way. So the next slide talks about the quick learnings that we had and what we see as opportunities, right? So that no matter what information was put out from what source, that providers and families turn to CPP and our CPP staff and volunteers as trusted relationships and partners where they can get reliable information. We also realized that our parent engagement had to be stepped up. We recognized that we had over 400 parents who had signed up on their applications to say we wanted to be volunteers and want to be more engaged with Preschool Promise. So those are the very first parents that we reached out to. And I am pleased to say that, you know, Flo and Kim have reached over 300 calls and contacts that they've made to those parents to say, hey, what do you need? What's going on? What do you think? How do we make sure that we stay engaged with you during this time? We also recognize the many differences between our family child care programs, our centers, our single sites, our multiple sites, and some differences that we're recognizing between TA and QI through this process. But it also creates great opportunity for us, mainly that we don't have to figure this out by ourselves. Everybody is focused on digital access and digital literacy and that instruction. So the rush that we had earlier in the year to say, how do we make sure every provider has a computer and every provider has the training and the access they need to technology, that has served us well. And now we have a whole team of people trying to help us figure out how everybody has access to that technology. We've had overwhelming support from volunteers and people saying, how can I help? And how can I support providers? We're all working together to say, how does community engagement look different? And how can we innovate on what that looks like? I bet we probably, none of us use Zoom so frequently as we do now. And there are some benefits to everybody doing that together. But I think most importantly, the whole world realizes how important early childhood education community providers are to the system, not only to keep touch and educate our kids, but to make sure that there is a safe, academically nurturing place for kids to go while the workforce is being mobilized as well. That's no longer a fight or a convincing point that I think that we have to do. I think everybody realizes the importance of our community providers and teachers in a new way. So with those learnings and opportunities, I also wanted to give you all a snapshot of kind of our move forward space and where we'll be going with our next step. Our daily activities are going to continue to be a source of information. How do we pass that information along, and how do we respond to gaps in services and be responsive to parents and providers? Our CPS partnership has been so essential in everything that we do, and we'll continue to work with them on a day-to-day basis and how that happens. From an administrative perspective, we look a little bit different than we've done in that we're all working outside of the building, and some tasks have taken greater priority. But we are ready now that we're not in the fighting fire stage anymore to kind of normalize and get back to pushing some of our pilot initiatives and other things. And I think being focused on our strategy for reopening, whether that happens in early May, whether that happens in the fall, whenever that happens, we have been positioning since day one, if not before that, to say, how are we ready for that reopening strategy? Not just the tactical pieces, but looking overall at the system to make sure that the community providers and especially family child care programs are not left out of the resources needed for that startup. So that is our snapshot.
Before I open it up for comments from other people, I'd like to simply say that Shara shared essentially the same presentation with the executive committee when it met about 10 days ago or so. And speaking on behalf of the executive committee, I think we were all of us just astonished at the quick pivot that Shara led with the organization to sort of reconceive the nature of its activities, the way it prioritized relationships with a variety of different stakeholder groups, tried to understand each of them more precisely so as to know what they would need, how best to communicate, and so on, so as not to stress them out with yet more emails that they had to pay attention to, and so on. The staff was just really right in there with that. The reference has been, Shara referenced and Sally picked up on the fact that each of the staff members manages now kind of a cohort of providers so that they have a single point of contact to get effective information that they can access. And the thing that came out very, very strongly as well, it's represented on this slide in front of you, is the really incredible working partnership with CPS. Vera had a little time with us to talk. Is she going to be able to speak with us a bit as well today, Shara, to talk about some of the things that they've been doing?
Yes, Vera should be on the call, and of course we discussed that she should be ready.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. Well, let's see if anybody else, well, first of all, anybody from the executive committee who would like to comment on that conversation, and or anybody who would like to ask questions about this tremendous body of work that Shara has just overviewed for us. It leaves you kind of numb, doesn't it? I mean,
It's exhausted and I'm not doing any of the work.
Right, right.
Father Graham, this is Marcia. I just want to offer just thanks for the hard work that the staff is doing in these very troublesome times. I'm kind of on the receiving end of that because I have a daughter that has a child in child care. And so I kind of see it from that end. And so I just want to thank you all for all your hard work and how you had to kind of jump and spin on a dime to get this all organized and to provide support for all these, the centers and business supports, because sometimes we forget that they are business owners and they have those stresses as well. So thank you for all your hard work.
Good words, Marcia. Thank you very much. Anybody else before we shift over briefly to Vera for a little bit of perspective from CPS? Vera, I think you're on if you'd like to say a few things.
Just real quickly, I just want to thank Shara for always being there. It's been a wonderful collaboration that we were kind of thrown into very, very quickly with things changing, not just daily, but changing every 5 minutes. So I totally appreciate Shara's communication and collaboration with me, and with CPS. CPP has been a very good partner. So we have tried our best to support CPP in an area because we fully understand that you're having to deal with a lot of the business end of things. So we try to help fill some gaps as far as the teaching and learning. So we have shared from the very beginning our remote learning packets. Any information, I appreciate that Shara and her team are real quick. When we put things out there, they get them on communication to your parents around. We have a CPS YouTube page. We now have on our website just a remote learning page that anybody can access. We also, partnership we've had for a while, Mission to Move opened it up, and they were very generous that I was able to share 3 different ways that families could access for the physical activity. And then this week we launched our Access TV on Spectrum 15 or Cincinnati Bell 804. So it runs 3 times a day. So no matter when a family situation is, that they can tap in, and that's pre-K through grade 12. So it's to help families in any grade level, and that will be expanding more in the weeks to come. This week was kind of our kickoff, let's try it, and we're finding it being very successful. So we're trying to fill all the gaps just as Shar and her team have, first of all, with the basic needs. You know, do you have food? Do you have the products you need in your home? We've been trying to share different things. I was telling Shara, and I'm hoping to get to her on Monday to put into the channel of communication. We've been working in partnership with Children's and some others that we've created a quick reference for parents, and we're making it into a infographic of if a parent's stressed out, what are some tips? What are some phone numbers that they can really reach out, like a one-stop snapshot? So we're just trying our best to whatever Shara says, hey, do you need, you know, we're just trying to help each other through this unprecedented time. So the partnership's very much appreciated, and we look forward to keep working with everyone. So Shara's been, and her team have been outstanding.
Vera, thanks very much for that overview and for all the good work that you and Shara are doing together on behalf of our children in the community. One of the things that's been very impressive, I think, for me in watching this over the course of the last number of weeks is the way in which these networks, which had already been kind of built, if you will, really assumed an enhanced level of importance.
Yes.
So that's been really remarkable to see. Any other comments or questions from other board members before we move on to the next part of the agenda, which is regarding committee updates?
I have one question. Is the general thought that the ratios are going to be reduced now for the not just foreseeable future, but maybe even longer than that? And if so, the cost of education has to go up. Do we think that's we thinking that's the way it's going to be?
Yes. You know, I think it may not be 6-1, but I would have trouble seeing, especially given what the governor said today about any plans to reopen anything are still going to require that social distancing, are still going to require that separation. It would be hard for me to believe that the ratios would return to what they were pre-pandemic. Now, if they'll stay as low as 6-1, I don't know, but it seems very likely that the ratios would be significantly lowered as to what they were before. And I think you'll see when we go through our kind of projected budget presentation, what we took into account as best we could without having all of the economic modeling right now is exactly that. So when you look at our go forward budget, it is how do cost of quality change based on there being less publicly funded childcare or other sources, though that CPP would be a greater last dollar in? How do we account for costs that may occur because ratios are different? And what that economic modeling means, there has to be a shift in how we assess and measure what that cost of quality will be.
Well, and I would think not just ratios, but occupancy loads. You can add more teachers into a room, but if the occupancy load has been halved, the effective student population is halved for that provider. I mean, the social distancing and the ratios and the occupancies could create quite a burden on a lot of the providers.
Okay, so,
Shara, can I
I
jump
don't have
in?
another room to use.
Shara, may I jump in real quick?
please do.
And so on our district end, we've been starting to have discussions about what future learning, future schools, what the future might look like. And I know Shara and I, we meet, well, we say we meet bi-weekly, but it's really daily. So I will start drawing her into those conversations when we get a little more details going, because I think that's something, as we're looking at different models, like hybrid models, and we're looking at different areas in the world that have reopened, and different strategies that have been used to have a child be in attendance, but maybe not physically have to be in attendance, which then can affect budgeting. I will definitely keep her in the loop on what we're learning in hopes that that will help on the provider side.
Yeah, and I think we're fortunate in that it's something that we don't have to figure out alone and only for CPP providers, because I think across the early childhood education network, we're all trying to figure out how that looks differently.
Well, wonderful. Shara, thanks again very much. We'll return to you in a bit for an executive director update. Although if you're doing a whole lot more else besides what you just summarized for us, I just don't know. I'll have a heart attack just thinking about it, I suspect. I can get started here with the respect to the executive committee. The executive committee met about 2 weeks ago, actually it was, and had an opportunity to review the material that you've just seen and learn about what great work the staff has been doing since our world changed along about the middle of March in this very powerful way. I'll yield it over to Pastor Tate then, if he'd like to speak about a little bit about where the Community Engagement Committee finds itself these days.
Thank you, Father Graham. I am impressed, very impressed with the work that Shara and the team have done with how they've been handling all of this. I mean, it really is, for a team of 6, 7 people to really have to manage as much as she had with the relationships and the partnerships is phenomenal. And she has really set the bar for not only how to manage in times of crisis, but also on, I think, in her forethought or in her future thinking of what to start planning for as it relates to, how we're going to be champions for our providers and our families on the backside of this. And our conversations and our meetings have really been forward thinking. We know that the conditions currently are out of our control. I think the challenge that we face is how do we stay within our wheelhouse, and how do we manage and leverage our resources to make sure that we're delivering on the promise and to maintain that focus. And they've done a Herculean job of staying on top of the programs and the providers, the network of providers and what they need, keeping engaged with CPS and 4C and all of the other coaching agencies has been, again, a tremendous effort. Again, I think I've expressed to Shara, however, and to the team that I am concerned about the people factor. And I heard a question earlier about it, but as a person who is currently having to fill in the gap for my grandson and to be responsible for teaching him every day, it is going to be a challenge for our providers to, in my opinion, to make sure that they are able to retool their centers as it relates to teachers and it relates to parent engagement. With kids being out during the summer, we've experienced parents leaving their children at home with older siblings. As we come out of this, I would hope that our outreach efforts with Flo and with Ms. Bolden are going to be over the top as we continue to do our outreach. We need to make sure the families understand that this is not a time to go on vacation with the children, especially those families and parents who are going to have to go back to work or look for jobs. Having that child care center or that family child care center or that provider is going to be an essential part of their reboot. And so messaging and other things of that nature have to be a part of that presentation now, because we have to redevelop families' mindsets. And I'm hoping to see what that looks like going forward. Again, having our P team out there, we probably need to ramp up on this just because there's going to be so many moving parts once we come out of this that families are going to be overwhelmed with decisions. And we want to be a part of their circle of influence. So when they ask the question, what should I do about my child? Automatically they think of Preschool Promise, or they think of calling or contacting their provider, whether they are currently with them or having to look for a new one, to make sure that that provider and or that the programs that we are providing support for are included in their decision making. So that's where I am, and that's where the committee is standing on Father Graham, and I'm hoping to continue the great work that Shara has already initiated.
I appreciate that update and your perspective, Pastor Tate. That work that the staff is doing to build stronger relationships with providers and with parents is going to serve us very well going into the future, as you observe. We'll turn things over to Cheryl to take us through the very complicated questions about how you prepare for an unknown future financially. You know, all of us in our own organizations, I'm sure, are facing this, and so it's much the same here. So Cheryl, I know that you and Hector have been doing a lot of work on this, so look forward to your sharing this information with everybody.
Well, thank you. And yes, in this environment, indeed, preparing the budget has presented some challenges. And I think out of necessity, it's become a dynamic and fluid process is probably how I would describe it. But while flexibility is really important, we still have to produce and approve a budget that supports our mission. And so I will join with everyone in applauding this staff. I've just been remarkably impressed with your positivity, commitment to the mission, leadership amongst this in a very challenging environment to help deliver the best results. In this budget, I believe that you'll see that as well. I thought to really tee this up, it's important to reframe for everyone what our process looks like these days in terms of budget approval and provide you with the dates that we're looking for. Obviously, today, this will be the Board of Managers' first time seeing this proposed budget. So today, what we'll do is take you through this information, and then we'll seek some feedback from you at the end of this. And then as well as I'll be inviting the rest of the Finance Committee to provide their insights, because they have seen this budget twice already. Then on May 5th, the Finance and Audit Committee will meet for the third and final time to incorporate any changes from today's feedback session. Also on that day, we'll be presenting this to the Executive Committee for a second and final discussion. And then on May 6th, CPP will be attending the CPS Board of Education public meeting on the fiscal year 21 budget. This is the first time we've really done it this way, and it is about aligning to partnerships and trying to make sure that we are in unison in terms of that budget approval process. which can be a little tricky with meeting dates and all that, but I think that's going to work pretty well. Then on May 14th, which is the next time our CPP Board of Managers comes together, we'll have a second pass approval of the final budget. And then sometime in June, CPS will approve their final budget, of which this will be a portion. So we thought that would be important to frame that up for everyone. And then onto the slide in front of you, I'm going to touch on some of the highlight big bucket items, and then I'll be turning it over to Hector to get into some detail around that. And I think Shara may have some comments along the way as well before we open it up for feedback. So if you think about our three big buckets, tuition assistance, quality improvement, cost of quality, we thought it's important to highlight some of the big changes that we'll be seeing in this budget versus prior year budget. In tuition assistance in particular, we're looking to add 100 average monthly student enrollment versus fiscal year 20 actuals. And we've also allowed in the budget for a 3% increase per student for the year, which is included in the master agreement, that allowable increase. Under the quality improvement work, the coaching expansion of 3 to 5 star and contract restructure have been contemplated and included in the budget. And then the cost of quality or wage subsidies, the wage pilot for 0 to 2 star has been included. 100% increase in teacher promise grants, so the dollars per teacher per year, and then increased teacher enrollment in teacher promise grants have all been contemplated. So pretty sizable increase in the cost of quality bucket. And then finally, we have a $500,000 contingency for post-COVID-19 restart, just contemplating the unknowns that might exist as we really step into this new normal. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hector, who's going to go over some charts in each of these three major areas, and then he'll go over the whole budget for you. So Hector.
Thank you, Cheryl. Before I move on to the chart, I just want to tell folks that we understand that CPS is a very fluid process right now in their budget. So we provided some dates, but we will piggyback. Our concept is to piggyback with CPS and move in tandem with them. And as they move their dates or their structure, we will try to move our dates and our structure. But once we have an approved budget, it makes it easier to do that than simply having to keep going over and over and over, not having an approved budget and having to come back to you for those items. Now, so I'll start now with the next slide. And this is basically a standard budget that you've seen in years past, where the charts are the charts you've seen in the years past. So it makes it easier for you to compare if you go across years. But I'm going to call your attention to the upper left in this chart, where we show in dark blue this fiscal year to date monthly enrollment. And these are the children that we pay for in that particular month. So I'm talking in financial terms. This would be what earlier was described as the average monthly student enrollment. This is the actual by month. If you look at the light blue, that would be what I would consider for fiscal year 21 to be our base enrollment, basically 200% FPL and below students. And the yellow line includes all other students, including QI converted students, including 200 to 250% of FPL and 250 to 300% of FPL students. So the upper left chart shows you that the yellow line, which is what we expect the total enrollment to be, would be about, on average throughout the year, about 100 students higher than it is this year. And as Cheryl was describing and Tony was asking about the uncertainty that we have about utilization or capacity or even attendance, the fact that we're budgeting about 100 students above where we are this year gives me some space to say we have some room to make changes based on what we see. we'll have to wait until the middle of the summer to really see how enrollment is going, to see if we're surpassing enrollment or we're below enrollment, to then come back to this board and explain what other changes we may need. But it is not a budget that is to the minimum numbers that we could see. So we should have hopefully some space to make adjustments. But again, we'll have to see as we get to the middle of the summer how enrollment is going. So just for your long-term reference, the lower left-hand corner provides you a look that ties to the upper left-hand corner about how each of those numbers is composed. So for example, if you looked at January, you would see in the upper left-hand corner, the yellow line is roughly around 815 students. And if you were to add the lower left-hand corner column, you should get to roughly about the same number. On the right, you'll see in numbers, the same elements, right? In dollars, how many dollars are we spending for base enrollment, covered QI seats, 200 to 250, 250 to 300. And I made clear in the past, I've used the nomenclature that this is a CPP budget, but I've gone beyond that and made clear for audience members who might not understand this, that this is on the community provider side only. Obviously, CPS has its own budget. I'll move on to QI. Well, actually, you know what? Let me pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions in TA, and then I'll move on to QI. Dr. Owens, I think you're on mute. I see your lips moving, but I don't hear you.
Increase in tuition.
I'm sorry, can you go again?
On the tuition, you had a 3% increase.
Sure.
You come up with 3% when post-corona, most places won't even have an increase. We've already decided for the institution we won't have an increase.
Yeah, so the master agreement provides each side, meaning the district and us, the ability to increase the maximum cost. And remember, this number is meant to reflect the maximum cost that it would take to educate the child by 3% annually. We thought that given we will be going into a more costly environment, meaning our providers will, it was wise to take the 3% increase that is allowed.
All right, thank you.
The other piece to note that we talked about at the Finance Committee meeting is that potentially our last dollar in contribution is going to be higher than previous years as other funding sources may decline. And so I don't, I think that this tuition assistant budget gives us some room with the assumptions on enrollment to be able to cover unknowns on that side.
All right, I'll move on to QI then. On the QI side, again, similar concept as in years past. There have a lot more slots because there are a lot more elements to the QI budget, but I'm gonna start in the upper left like I did with tuition assistance, and I'm gonna start with that orange line. That orange line was our forecast for the number of converted seats to high quality. In this year, our target, according to the master agreement, was 400 seats. And we actually get close to that number, 398, 400. But we've also provided it for you, divided by the type of location. So a type A provider, a type B provider, and a center. So as you look at the cumulative number in the orange line, below it, you will see by quarter where we expect the seats. Now, in the past, I would be very frank with you, the actual quarter where the seats are converted switches a lot based on whether For example, a center that was expected to come in Q2 came in Q1. But this year in particular, as you heard from Chara, there's been a freeze on decisions about moving up or down. People are frozen until September. So I can pretty certainly tell you that Q1 is not going to look like it's there. But we wanted to establish a budget that was a running operational budget that we could subsequently move the seats to other quarters, but have the funding available to generate those seats. And beside or below every one of those numbers, there's a center, there's a capacity to that center that has been highlighted, that Brittany has looked at, that she's looked at their projections and their coaching and understands that there's a likelihood of them moving up. So that's how this budget is built. On the left-hand side, but at the bottom instead of at the top, is simply to show you centers that would be actively spending versus graduated to high quality. And somewhere in the middle, meaning coming into the pipe. On the right, you'll see each of the different expenditures that we experience in quality improvement in dollar terms. So of the total $2.2 roughly million budget that we have for quality improvement, how much of that graphically and in numbers you can see is spent on coaching, how much on learning environment, how much on outdoor learning space, teacher, educational resources, professional development, insurance, and other. And I did that last year as well because it gives you a good snapshot very quickly of where our funds are flowing, meaning how we're helping our providers. I'll wait here for a moment to see if there are any questions.
Hector, it's Terry. I don't know what's wrong with my camera. You can't see me. But
I can hear you.
Okay. I was wondering, what are the numbers for the centers that are like in limbo right now, like between QI and TA? So do you know that are just kind of almost there and they were waiting and then this happened and they're stuck?
So, Hector, I can take that one.
Great, thank you, Chair.
We did an assessment with 4C to say who are those, and what we've identified is potentially 116 quality seats that could be available from the providers that were in QI who have something pending that we thought within the next 60 days, if the approval process were to go through, that they would be moving to 3 stars or higher and eligible for tuition assistance. That 116 seats is the max capacity. And I am, what I can tell you is the majority of those are still open and active and providing pandemic care.
Oh, great.
Right. So we looked very closely when we did these numbers with 4C and with Brittany to say, if these are people that, if there is a lack of quality seats, who do we go to first that say we may be able to grant provisional status, or what we may be able to do, and how may we be able to structure something to say we'll give you provisional high quality status with us for CPP until we know that review process can come. And as long as you continue with the coaching and on the path we've seen, and these things are lined up, this is what we have in order to make sure that those quality seats will be available. So it's about between 90 and 116, Ms. Terry, but it's also dependent. That would mean if all of the kids in those seats were preschoolers, and that may or may not happen.
Okay, and those particular centers, are they going to be receiving additional support once we start coming out of this? Because that's going to be the issue.
So those are the ones that have been prioritized for coaching at a first level as they have capacity to do it, comparable to how we prioritize for the 3 to 5 transition, those that had just switched to tuition assistance. So when we start talking about who are we prioritizing for coaching to give support, we're able to do that. But the question is not just coaching, but also other supports.
Mm-hmm.
We're monitoring those providers very carefully, as we are with all pandemic providers, to say if there are additional supports you need. For instance, you need to outfit a second classroom for preschoolers because you now have a lower ratio number. We're going forward and making sure that they're able to do that, but we are ready to marshal the additional support in addition to coaching that can make sure that those providers can provide those quality seats and operate.
Great, great. Thank you.
All right, I'll move on to cost of quality then. Thank you, Chara. So in cost of quality, it looks a little different. We don't have that upper left. We just have a left and a right chart. But the program elements are there. You can see in blue the number of teachers is on the left. And normally that's what I have. I have operational measures on the left, financial measures on the right. The number of teachers in TPG, that's the Teacher Promise Grants. We have the 0 to 2 star grants, or the staff support fund is the other way that that is discussed. And then we have the TAB, which is the teacher advancement bonuses, which are for advancing educational achievement. So as you look on the right, you can see the how the dollars are budgeted. Teacher Promise Grants, roughly, I would say 40%. Staff Support Fund, roughly the 55%, and then a small percentage for teacher advancement bonuses. I'll pause here briefly to see if there are any questions.
Mike Graham here, Hector. I presume that as you show the $10,000 worth of bonuses in a little block all by itself, those will be spread out across the course of the fiscal year, huh? How is it that you arrived at that number, 10,000? I'm just curious as to the thinking behind it.
I looked at the experience we have this year. We've had a number of bonus requests, and it's very interesting how they come in as well, but they come in clumps, normally around some deadline. And so I looked at how much we've spent this year.
So great, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right, I'll move on to the next chart, which actually is a table. So here I've gone full geek on you and provided numbers galore. This is the same information you saw in the previous slides is included in here, along with the overhead area, along with the forecast for this year, along with the budget for last year. So it's a lot of data in one place. But I will briefly discuss it this way. If you look at the column that says fiscal year 21 budget, it's to the left of the first greenish brown column. That is the budget for this year. If you look at the first greenish brown one, that's the forecast for this year. Then the purple lilac looking one is the budget we had for fiscal year 20. I'm sorry, I've been saying this year, but as you can see, it's fiscal year 21. I mean, the year I'm talking about. Then you get back to that brown greenish column, which is between the two purple ones. That one relates back to the other brown greenish column. And it's basically the fiscal year 21 budget minus the forecast for this year. Therefore, the column that is second from the right provides you how this budget is an increase over what we expect to spend this year. The rightmost column provides you how the budget is an increase over what we budgeted for this year. So that's why they will be different. I've marked increases in blue and flat or no increases left without color. In the lower portion, I've provided you some key changes versus the forecast for this year. And I did that because I think that providing key changes versus something we decided a year ago, which is just a budget, not the actual spending, is not very useful. So I've provided it versus what we're doing this year. And what you'll see there are some of the elements that we discussed in the first slide, but I've quantified for you some of those dollars. So for example, if you were to look at the $728,000 increase in tuition assistance shown in the column that's the second from the right. So as you go from right to left, that second column, which is the column I will speak about from now on, is roughly divided into an increase of 100 students is about $550,000, and the 3% increase that Dr. Owens asked about is about $125,000 of impact. And so on down the line for each of the impact areas, so that you can see versus today and where we think fiscal year 20 will end today, what are the significant changes? So as I go down there, down that line, the largest items that you will see right away, right, are the increase of students. It'll be the 3 to 5 star coaching. It'll be the 0 to 2 star staff support. And one of the parts that we found in the finance and audit committee meeting that was very useful about looking down there is that as you start to think about, oh, wait a minute, what if my enrollment stays flat versus this year? Well, then you know you have $550,000 to cover some other issue. Or, as was described during finance and audit, Hector, can you take a look at, as the year progresses, which of these are available to us? Which of these buckets, when we make choices as a board to free up if we need funds somewhere else, or to increase if we see high take up and high success in some of those areas. And as normal, I will say I've changed my description a little bit, but there is a fee that I've been asked about in the past, which is the United Way administration fee, which I show it as an increase of $100,000 versus this year. And but the United Way normally waives this fee. So even though it's budgeted, we don't expect to see the fee.
That's right. So they have not made that decision as of yet. So
correct, and that's why it's still in our budget, is they have not made that choice. But they are off cycle from us, right? They use a calendar, or we are off cycle from them. They use a calendar budgeting timeline and decision-making timeline. We use a fiscal one that cuts right into the middle of their budget.
Right. Thank you, Hector. Great job.
So Cheryl, can I ask a question? It's Pastor Tate. So as I'm reading this, am I seeing that we're increasing our funding in certain areas like QI, and even I understand what, based on Dr. Owens' question about the 3% increase as it relates to the master agreement. What I don't see is our planning for the increase in staff or temporary staff. I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong, that we're going to have the capacity to manage all of the moving parts with the staff that we currently have and keep up with what needs to happen. And so while we're increasing in our coaching, and I don't see where we're going to need new coaching in this next 6 to 9 months or even a year, based on the current state of our economy and the current state of the work that is going to be necessary to rebuild some of these centers. And so I would hope that we are planning for an increase in our staff, whether it's just pre-team or whether it's in adding some additional people on the ground in some aspect. But it definitely, in my opinion, is not going to be in coaching as it will be people on the ground, outreach, and other things like that. So is that built in, or did I miss that, or what's going on here?
Sorry,
No,
would you like?
you did not.
I can tell you, thank you, Pastor Tate, for that. What I will say is some of the things we had unfilled positions that were already in the budget for some increase in staff and P team. You will see some increases related to the master coach and additional support staff there. Until we have a better idea of what the skill level will be with those and what support staff it is, and how the staff needs to expand and how we do that strategically, I was not comfortable just adding random staff without being able to assess what that is. And so we may, in fact, come back to you and say, we've reallocated and we've moved in this way. But for now, that master coach being fully staffed with the budget that we have in these additions, because you got to remember we have 2 additional P team positions that haven't been filled this year that were already in the budget, right? And so this is an addition to the budget. So we will always be ready, and I am not shy about coming back to the board and saying we need more help. But what that looks like, I don't want to project beyond this amount, because I always want to be cognizant and not appearing top heavy, making sure we're administering administrative costs and having clear line of sight to what that staff is going to do and who it needs to be. You will notice that, some of the things that we pulled out before were staffing that we were going to share with other agencies, that we were going to promote other grant opportunities like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And talking about that grant, what we said is we need to build internal capacity with that, and we need to be ready to do that. And what you'll see is a reflection of a start to that, but you are absolutely right. We may need more with outreach and staff people to do that. But we'll also need somebody to help us mobilize volunteers to do that as well, because we will never be able to afford all of the staff that it'll be able to, and all the people that'll be needed to get that work done.
So to that point then, Shara, I would like to see us prepare, even on the P team level, hiring some grandmothers and parents of kindergartners who have already gone through the process of preschool, to help us navigate through some of the challenges of our parent engagement and even our provider engagement. And it doesn't have to be a full salary person. It can be a temporary stipend, but to not put it in the budget now, knowing that that's going to be a need, I don't think we're going to have, in my opinion, I don't think we're going to have time once this all kicks off for you to come back to the board. I know you have a lot of flexibility, but I would love for this board to be prepared for the work, the groundwork that is going to be necessary to bring these centers back online. And it's going to be, in my opinion, beyond our capacity, our staff's current capacity. And that's not something that we should take lightly, in my opinion.
I have a
Mike
question.
Graham here. Let me jump in. Maybe the way to do this would be to designate a line for contingency that would allow that kind of flexibility in funding. The reality of the matter is that that the future is dynamic and fluid, as Cheryl put it at the beginning of the presentation, and we simply aren't going to know until that future is almost right on top of us exactly how best to respond. That perhaps a place to even think about it would be within the line marked COVID-19 restart contingency, or to think of the $500,000 there already as potentially covering some incremental staffing that might be needed. Actually, as I think about it, I'm thinking about it out loud. That's probably exactly where it already could be seen to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to thank everybody who put so much time and effort in this budget. Very, very well done, very well thought through. But I want to offer some thoughts about contingencies that look something like this. And I don't know all the financing sources for CPS, but I know some of them are tax-based, which may be income, which may be property. And a lot of that feeds through and feeds into employment. So the concern that I have is this is a model, and we have had the luxury in the past of approving a model that we had a great deal of certainty about income to feed the model. So in reading the newspaper after the CPS retreat on Saturday, there were several issues that were raised about financing relative to the next fiscal year. And there were words that were used in, according to the paper, I wasn't there at the retreat, that there may need to be cuts, there may need to be layoffs. There were a lot of things that were put on the table. So my question to the preparers of this budget, are there contingencies built in this where there are clear and present priorities that we have that if we're not able to fund them, then we can't fully operate, where we may have to look at less money? I'm just putting this out there. And at what point do we pivot? A lot of structures are having to pivot. City of Cincinnati, Hamilton County, agencies. So I'm talking about how quickly can we pivot and how closely can we get to Jen Wagner, the Finance Committee, with these thoughts that I'm raising about, not flexibility, but certainty that there may be things that are above our control with respect to the income that has fed this budget in the past.
Yeah, and Debbie, you bring up some very important points. Jen Wagner did participate as, of course, a committee member of our Finance Committee, and had a lot to say about this topic at our most recent Finance Committee meeting. And the reality is there are unknowns about what that might look like in the coming year. And so definitely something that we will rely on Jen to help us monitor and be as prepared as we possibly can be going forward. I will tell you, and then I'll flip it over to Shara for her comments, but I can tell you that just based on what I've seen just in this past 4 weeks with this team, when it comes to being able to pivot, I have a high degree of confidence that we will figure out how to do the most to advance our mission with what we have. And with that, Shara, I welcome your insights.
I'm sorry. I will say, yesterday CPS had a very detailed meeting talking about exactly that. What the forecast looks, what the budget looks like, how they're going to plan for that, and how we're going to measure, the changes in revenue and what happens and how they're going to forecast that. They had 3 ways of talking about how they may present and prepare their budget. So we are very closely in lockstep with CPS and looking at what that revenue may look like and the changes that we need to make. But I will also say there are elements of this budget that we have that we know we can instantly, as you said, pivot, pull the trigger, and cut back expenses that are controlled expense items that we can still deliver on the mission and make some adjustments in how we do this. I mean, there's some things that are necessary, but if we are all in a place of cutting back, there are places that we can look at and say, how do we prioritize what our spending is for here?
I really appreciate that. And I knew you'd have, looked at all of this, but I think for the record, it's very important as other groups, go forward and look at the daily, the minute by minute changes that we're all faced with. And I have the greatest amount of confidence that you all are the king and queens and prince and princesses of pivot.
It's going to be a busy year for the Finance and Audit Committee, I think.
This is Vanessa. I'm sorry I'm late, and I've been listening for a few minutes, and Debbie shared some of the concerns that I have, and and I just want to ask, even the last time I talked to Laura, the tax, and I've been listening to some of the county stuff, but the property tax collection rate is down as well. And just even looking at things like re-looking at this budget based on what we already know. So like the staff expenses, especially as the district is looking at laying off people and seeing that our projections are almost, oh wow, $180,000 more. And from a public, you know, from a public review standpoint, how do we even look at increasing a staff-related function when some of our expenses, everybody's going online, so you're saving in mileage, you're saving in electricity, you're saving in, so, you know, making these adjustments to the budget now, knowing that it's going to take a long time, especially for the populations that we serve. I'm having a lot of this conversation at the Urban League and other organizations, the national picture and the fear that this pandemic has created in the Black community specifically, that it's going to take a long time to even have people trust their children in this space. And will enrollment, even our enrollment projections, should be reforecasted based on the data of what is being forecasted and seen. And even with the district talking about not even sure if they are going to even, I mean, just really thinking through this budget and taking it back through a different lens than what has been discussed over the last 2 months, based on the realities of what today is and how soon it will be before people even start to pay property taxes when they're choosing basic needs for food and housing and keeping their kids in because they're not trusting they won't get the virus, and distance learning, and, you know, especially in preschools, that it will be sometime even before that. And I'm even wondering if there's been any conversation with the governor's office about how they are going to help stave the, small businesses. There are lots of small business loans and all that stuff, but I think we need to look at the resources that are being poured into the community as well, and or leaving, and the impact that that's going to have if people don't have jobs. They're going to have their kids at home. So our enrollment projections are probably off as well. I think we need to think about all those things.
I would like to support that. I believe that we're going to have to adopt a budget that is just a total guess based on history at this time, because we just really don't know if so many people are laid off or furloughed, who's going to go to childcare, who are preschool, the community-based part of this is largely overwhelmingly working families. And if we have far, far, far fewer working families in the first quarter, maybe the second quarter, I think the idea of budgeting for 100 new families and budgeting for some big increase is okay. I just don't think we should be expecting there to be an increase. I think that 100 child increase, I would be thrilled if we saw that. I think we'll have 100 fewer children or 200 fewer children because there aren't jobs for those parents.
Yes, Allie, that's right. And I think the important thing is, well, we forecasted in that adding 100, the reality is it's a dollar number. And so maybe that dollar number ends up being used because the cost of each child ends up being more because we have we have a limit on how many children can be in the classroom. So I think there will be that type of flexibility built in there that we're going to have to be responsive to. And I think, Vanessa, I agree. I think, I'm looking forward to, we've got a little bit of time here, and I think that's going to help us better understand the data, understand how we might integrate it to make any alterations to this budget. And I think also having the opportunity on May 6th to have some public feedback will be incredibly valuable for us as well. So I could say I will not surprise me if this does look different when we come back on May 14th to this group.
The other thing, and I also don't know enough really to speak on this, but Vanessa talked about adding staff at this time and the question about that. I guess I wanted to understand what the, and maybe you said it, but it's too much going on in my head. What the master coach, that's an expensive new position, and why and how, what is, given our coaching groups and our current staff, what is that, and is that a totally needed thing at this time?
So I will be happy to weigh in and talk to you about what we had envisioned as the master coach, but at some point, in alignment with the recommendations that were originally made for implementation, is to develop some internal capacity for us to do that coaching through a master coach. Also recognizing that the coaching requirements may be different and there may be new rules and regs for us to address that as well. I will, you know, in response to the question about is it necessary at this time, we don't know what is necessary. As you said, this was our best projection of what we thought would be needed. If that looks different, and as Pastor Tate said, it needs to be P team members that we invest the staff dollar in rather than a master coach, we have the fluidity to do that. But the original model was saying, how do we develop internal capacity in partnership with those that have expertise in coaching to be able to do that in a more personalized way with our community providers?
If I may, since I was part of that original plan, we went against that plan to do it the way we did it. And since then, we've invested way more in coaching from the outside. And so it sounds duplicative to me. And again, I think that what we should be doing is looking for ways to operate more efficiently. Thinking about how, because, you know, when we talk about this COVID-19 and we talk about a resurgence, if we can't keep people inside, that it could resurge and that this could be going on for a year, an entire school year. And I mean, conversations I've had with, you know, Melba Moore, and on a conversation with, on the phone with Senator Brown, and, you know, from the federal standpoint is that the main thing that people want to keep in place is infrastructure, and then making sure that families who are these service workers, small businesses, this is such a volatile time, and the look and feel, especially if this doesn't even go on the ballot, which is still being discussed. But the look and feel of a budget where everybody is concerned with food on the table, we have to look at this budget and figure out how to be as efficient as we can. Terry England. Terry, I don't know if you've talked about some of the strategies that you're using, where you have gone to Zoom and meeting families where they are. And I don't understand how we've added so much to coaching, bringing in the experts who have the ability to adapt technologically and taking learning into the classroom. And I say this is, we really need to look at, you know, I get to watch my granddaughter in a Zoom classroom, you know, inside the home. And how do we think about making sure that we can adapt to something that may last an entire school year, as opposed to building a budget and the way we function on things that we've already said we wouldn't do it that way. So I think, you know, and I've shared this in the finance committee meeting, that adding new dollars before was tenuous when you have to go back to the ballot. You know, when you go back to a levy, the last thing people want to see you asking for more money. And for us to be asking for more money when the district is talking about laying off paraprofessionals, you know, sending people home, and the city is talking about doing garbage once a month, and we are talking about being more extravagant, I do not think we have the luxury of doing that, because this is taxpayer money, and taxpayers are not going to be able to afford, when you look at who's taxed the most, and where that cost is being passed along to. I was on a call just a few minutes ago where talking about how much of these families are getting evicted. And these are the folks who are not going to choose childcare and even having the ability to pay that $8 may be a hardship. And so I really think we need to go back and scrape this budget so that it's not extra staff or extra bodies, but it's extra. If we're gonna have extra money, is to figure out how to adapt to a remote environment so that children, the disparities in learning that are already there, the gaps are for these children. I think we got to go back to the core and all of our research and say, why are we doing this? And it's to make sure that children are ready to learn, and the disparities that are about to happen to those who live in poverty, the gap is going to widen. So what we need to be thinking of more importantly than a master coach is how we make sure children are learning. And if we're going to add more money, we need to add more money to the very reason that the preschool promise came on board in the first reason.
I really appreciate that, because when we look at children, we look at families, and I talk to my families in a Zoom meeting every week, and they are sent messages and links almost every day by me. The one thing that they are saying is that they are concerned whether we're going to be able to do this or not. So once ODJFS come out with systems and strategies that we as programs have to follow, then we make a decision. Right now, all of us are in limbo, whether we're open as a pandemic center or not. But communicating with our parents is the one thing that we have as a community provider. We have that. We've connected with our parents, so we stay in touch with them, and they are afraid to send their children in. Some of them are, Miss Terry, I really appreciate you. I know that you'll take care of them, but I have to have a system in place to make sure that happens. How are we going to support the families as they go through this, and go through uncertainty on their part? There are tangible things that they need right now. I had to go out to one parent's home with my mask and drop off a case of Pampers. She's got 3 children, 2 in diapers, 1 preschooler. So I'm giving books out of my supply, which I don't mind, giving books, giving toys, making up packets. We made up packets before we even had to close because we had a feeling like this was going to happen. But they need tangible things that they know that's coming from Cincinnati Preschool Promise. They need to know that we are there, not just, they appreciate the calls, I'm sure, and the programs appreciate the calls, but the programs need to be supported in providing those tangible things for our families.
I want to thank everybody for the very spirited conversation on this, and remind everyone that this conversation today is a point in time in the development of the budget. There'll be additional opportunities for additional conversation with CPS, in which we can have conversations with them about how the collection of these revenues looks to them, and what kind of adaptations they're making in light of those projections. Bring that into our own thinking. So there'll be a number of other meetings of the Audit and Finance Committee. And so I encourage the heavy lifting that's going to need to get done in that meeting against the background of the conversation that was put here. But I'd like to thank Cheryl, Hector, the other members of the committee for getting us to this point. And we'll look forward to seeing where this goes in the future. And I'm sure that it'll come back to us with some significant changes by the time we see it in May. Char, I'm going to turn to you now for your executive director update.
Thanks. I think I have shared many of the things that I've been doing and the team has been doing. What you'll see is the resource snapshot of additional resources that we've been posting on our website, sharing through social media for families as well. Also wanted to share that we will be have been surveying all providers to your suggestion, Ms. Terry, about what they may need in terms of tangible resources to determine how we may be able to provide some immediate need things to providers, like hand sanitizer, like mask, like those essential pieces that we need, how we may be able to coordinate that better to make sure that those immediate needs are met and we can harness the power that we have through different networks to be able to do that. I also have to say a thank you to the members of the Board of Managers who we've leaned on and relied on their expertise and been able to share that expertise with our providers and parents. Particularly Dr. White and the Urban League, and your coronavirus series that you've done has been very helpful for parents and providers. To Marcia Futel in connecting us with those business supports and helping us think a little bit differently about how we harness the work of the African American Chamber of Commerce. And of course to Dr. Owens for the fact sheets that you've put out about health and safety, for us not having to create and do those resources, but being able to provide them and make them immediately available to providers has been very helpful. What you will also see in the coming weeks is a new series of roundtables that we'll be doing with providers in small groups that will just be an open FAQ question and answer session to make sure that we can respond to their needs and try to get them all of the things that they need on a more immediate basis, as well as a networking opportunity that some providers have requested to be able to meet and talk with each other as well. We are continuing to participate, again, as I said, in the virtual community council meetings and maybe tapping on you as Board of Managers to help us and co-present with us at those community council meetings. And if we had an ask of our Board of Managers, it would be to help us, in terms of signing up to be promise readers. Some of you have done that as outreach as well. Sending to us ideas, and particularly to Lakeisha, on how we celebrate providers for the work that they're doing, knowing that on May 8th, the National Provider Celebration Day is happening. We don't want to miss the opportunity to do that as well. And as always, sharing with us recommendations, ideas, what you may hear from the community and providers so that we're able to more efficiently and effectively do the work that we've been tasked with. And finally, I would say, it has been so important to have such a committed preschool promise team, and I really want to say a heartfelt thank you and to acknowledge all members of the staff for all of the hard work that they've been doing while managing their own personal challenges to really reach out to the community, to do their best, to go above and beyond, and that the commitment that they've made to continue to do that. And as Father Graham said, this is a moment in time. We take all feedback and welcome it, knowing that we share with you what we're doing today and what we know true to be today, and that may change and will have to change tomorrow and going forward.
Thanks very much, Chara. Before I go to, I think I saw both Leisha Lyman and Vera Brooks. I didn't see if Craig was present. But any final comments or questions for Chara before we go to the observers for their comments?
Yes, it's Odell. I have a question, Chara.
Sure, Odell.
I just completed my 29th year on the board of U.S. Bank, and Wednesday was my last meeting. In honor of me leaving, they told me they were going to give Preschool Promise $10,000. Have you received that yet?
We have not, and thank you.
That is awesome.
So you're going to get 10 grand. So just let me know when you get it so I can make sure it has happened.
Oh, Odell, you've just set the bar very high.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for that. That's terrific. Anyone else?
I have a comment. I really do want to thank Chara for her receptivity and her availability to receive suggestions and without judgment or conjecture. She's just open to exploring every opportunity. And I just want to say how much I appreciate what you are doing, both to hold your team together, knowing how difficult this is, especially the isolation, how difficult that can be. And so I just want to show some appreciation for you as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hear, hear. I think that that would express the sentiment of a great many of us, all of us, I hope. Anybody else before we go to Vera and Leisha? So Vera and Leisha.
Yeah, hey, it's Leisha. Yeah, I certainly, I always feel like there's so many things I want to echo that everyone said, but I'm not going to do that. What I am going to mention is, you know, just to reemphasize, I think Shara and team and sort of, you know, the navigation of this whole early childhood system that we all have been working through over the last few weeks, and many stops and starts, and right now really essentially kind of in a holding pattern waiting for the next directive from the state. And that's one of the reasons why we pulled together, Success by Six pulled together a local implementation sort of team related to, you know, keeping track of what was happening at the state and then being able to really think about how that looks locally, both within the unique structure that CPP has, but also in thinking about the larger early childhood system and other providers in the region. So, you know, I know that sometimes providers and even CPP sometimes feels like they're alone in this, and many of the questions that I think we are asking of Shara and her team in this effort are certainly ones that we're all grappling with and trying to solve together. But also in terms of our approach, making sure that as we're looking at pivoting strategies as an early childhood system, that we are also making sure that we're keeping CPP close within that and being able to make sure that we're also being responsive to their unique needs as well. And so a lot of that in terms of the way what United Way has been up to over the last few weeks, I know many of you are very familiar with the joint relief fund that we've had set up with GCF, have certainly been pushing dollars out, much of, or some of which has been toward the pandemic child care effort. But I have been in constant communication with Shara around what are some of those unique needs that she's seeing within the CPP providers, and trying to think of ways that we can work in different types of strategies and requests to really help in a way that we can do that brings the private sector alongside the public sector. So looking at ways to do that, also thinking about, you know, going forward, and I think someone said this earlier, I don't remember who, but figuring out how do we leverage volunteers. We're going to need a groundswell of people to really reset this system. And it will not be what it was when we came out of it, not from a quality standpoint, not from a enrollment standpoint, not from a staffing standpoint. So it will be a true reset, and wanting to make sure that, you know, United Way is looking at, and particularly within Success by Six, what do we offer as additional capacity to the child care network to really be able to help in terms of additional outreach, galvanizing of volunteers, those things that we, you know, have structures to do and have a capacity to do in communities. So, and then lastly, I would just say, you know, I think that there is, the other thing related to that, we have had some gracious donations recently from Procter & Gamble with hand sanitizer and some masks. We're doing some coordination of delivery on that right now, but I was able to secure a certain percentage of those for childcare providers, those that are providing pandemic care right now. And then hopefully we will have a second round coming where we can have a more broader distribution, but working with CPP on what that looks like in terms of numbers and helping to get that out to folks that are in need of those supplies and very hard to come by for us, let alone folks that are really needing that to serve the families that they serve. And then lastly, I just want to magnify, I think, what Vanessa said earlier in terms of, you know, this whole, you know, the short-term piece, but the long-term effect on it, on achievement and what we can expect to see. I've heard people coin the term the double summer slide that we're going to see, and how that's magnifying disparities that we know are there. And what, you know, we think that we're going to sort of deal with this year, but this is going to be a multi-year effect. And it's, you know, that in terms of what CPP is about, why we're here, why we're all doing this, you know, I think we need to brace ourselves for what that's going to look like, you know, beyond the budget. But when we get to kindergarten readiness results and those kinds of things, we have to remember what we're experiencing right now, and how that's going to show up for children and families. So I just wanted to reiterate that, to make sure everyone's ready for the long haul on this. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you. And thank you very much for the offer of doing what you can in terms of the Procter & Gamble donation of sanitizers, masks, etc. So that's terrific.
Yep.
Vera, we heard from you earlier. Anything else you'd like to say?
I just have 3 quick comments. First of all, Alicia, I agree with everything you just said. A correction on the TV channel. It was on our part. It is channel 804, not 803. So just so everyone knows that. I want to give hats off to Shara and her entire staff. I think the cohorts with a staff member for the next 12 months is outstanding to be responsive to their specific needs. I think to get through all this, it's going to be a matter of maintaining trust, building relationships, and just showing we care. I think the families are out there. I think they're anxious in a lot of ways, but we can at least let them know that we are here, and I appreciate your all's board for keeping an open mind and moving forward together with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. An active engaged meeting as per always with this active and engaged group. You can see the future meetings in front of us. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved by Cheryl.
Thank you, Cheryl, and a second to that
Second
motion.
by Laura.
Laura, thank you very much for seconding it. And all those in favor, please signify by clicking your leave meeting buttons. We'll see you all next time.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Father.
Thank you.